Hello everyone and good evening. I'm Don Arleth and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. One of the main reasons that Vladimir Putin cites for invading Ukraine was to prevent the country from joining NATO. Although NATO membership for Ukraine was not on the table at the time, this is a classic line of Kremlin disinformation. However, ironically, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine produced unintended consequences for the Kremlin, which indeed was the expansion of NATO along Russia's borders. Take Sweden. Previously, it was a neutral state, but the threat that Vladimir Putin posed caused the country to abandon neutrality and join NATO. It's now been 1 year since Sweden joined NATO, and now joining me to discuss this decision on the first anniversary is Jakob Hallgren, director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Hello, sir, and thank you very much for joining us today on World Talks.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, now time does pass quite quickly. How do Swedes assess the decision now, especially since we've seen kind of a shaking up of the political landscape, if you will, but how do they assess the decision to join NATO?
Well, I would like to say if there wasn't a bit of a worry and some discussion, of course, as relates to the new policy directions coming out of Washington. Now, that being said, a vast majority of Swedes, as it is seen in polls and from what I hear and I sense, are of course quite happy that we're part of NATO today, because just imagining the alternative being somehow in between NATO and an aggressive and expanding Russia is not a particularly nice place to be. And I think all Swedes realize that, yes, we're going to have to expand our defense expenditure, but if we would have been outside, not neutral maybe, but non-aligned, even though we would have been in close partnership with NATO, would have been far more costlier. So for those two reasons, Swedes are in general very happy that we came in when we came in together with Finland.
Right. Now, concerning that expenditure, where do you think the country is headed in the immediate future? Donald Trump has been suggesting for NATO members to spend north of 5% of GDP. Where do you think Sweden is going to fall into this category concerning spending?
Well, it's difficult to say. I see signs and hear very clearly that the discussions are ongoing. I mean, Sweden did actually embark on quite a journey from, let's say, 10 years ago, where we were down to just above 1% of GDP, to being already at 2.6 today, and Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, of course, boosted this enormously. Now, there is a discussion about further increases. Where that will land, I think, will depend on, I'd say, the outcome of the Hague summit, the NATO summit in The Hague in June. I know that President Donald Trump has spoken about 5%. The US itself only spends 3.4, 3.5. But I would guess, even though I don't know, that it probably lands somewhere around 3 or maybe up to 3.5 or somewhere around there. But as said, nothing has been communicated as of yet, even though I know that there are intense discussions about that in Sweden as well.
Right. Now, just a few years ago, it was said by some experts around the world that actually NATO had lost its purpose, that Russia really wasn't a threat. Here we are standing just a few years after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it seems that the purpose, the rebirth of purpose of NATO is certainly there, but we are seeing some very different signals coming out of the United States. What do you think the future of NATO is right now?
Well, I think this is the thought that is on everybody's minds now. How far-reaching, how permanent is the American policy shift? And there will be some interesting and important indicators as to when it comes to NATO's future, with the NATO Foreign Ministers Summit in early April, and then, of course, the Hague Summit in June. I think there are a couple of lessons. First of all, there is a fairly massive unity among European members of NATO, with a few exceptions that we all know about that the Europeans and the European pillar of NATO, of course, needs to be considerably strengthened, both for NATO's itself and then, of course, in terms of supporting Ukraine. And then, obviously, there are concerns about the American commitment to Article 5, etc., even though it needs to be said that the exercises are continuing, and I mean, all of the military collaboration is continuing. So I mean, we of course think, and I think there are many efforts from European leaders to talk with the Americans, understand what their concerns are, and see how we can meet them in a spirit where we will, of course, not only preserve but also hopefully strengthen the alliance in the future. It's been through crises before, and I hope that we'll be able to overcome this one as well, even though we are, of course, only saying that as newcomers to the alliance.
Right. Now, given the fact that Russia has tried its darndest to take Ukraine in 3 years, it has been rather unsuccessful in that quest. Does Russia still pose a direct military threat to Europe, or has this failure in Ukraine shown us that the likes of it attacking Europe are rather unlikely?
To be honest, I think that the jury is still out, and it depends on our own behavior and the extent to which we support and enable Ukraine to, first of all, fight for its survival. And if there were to be an agreement, that agreement is made on terms which are acceptable to Ukraine. Because, and I think this is a widely held view in not only Sweden, but many of the Nordic countries, and I think in Poland as well, if we were to agree to a deal which happens at the expense of Ukraine, and where some of Russia's unacceptable war aims are reached, that will have far-reaching consequences for the credibility of NATO and for Europe, and there is a risk that Russia would divert or move its attention to other countries, either outside or in the immediate neighbor, or even within NATO. So I think it's incredibly important, and I think that's a widely held view, as I said, to continue to support Ukraine as much as we can in this endeavor.
And we've seen also Sweden embark upon its first NATO mission there in the Baltics, deploying a contingent there. Do you believe that actually the Baltics are potentially the most vulnerable part in NATO at the current time that could face Russian aggression?
Well, I mean, there's of course talk about Baltic states. That even though we haven't seen any concrete signs of Russian advances towards them, over and above, of course, the ongoing hybrid attacks and hybrid activities that we see in the whole region, whether it is underwater infrastructure, in the cyber domain, and the disinformation domain, instrumentalization of migration, etc. Of course, whether that is the most exposed of NATO territory compared to others, I don't know, but that there is quite some activity where sometimes, admittedly, it's a little bit different to kind of render attribution, but that there is a lot of footprints, I'd say, Russian and even Chinese around this region, and that we need to take that incredibly seriously. We need to think about how we tailor deterrence to counter that. I think that goes without saying. And as you mentioned, that NATO mission, Baltic Sentry, which Sweden is participating, is an important step in showing resolve from NATO's side.
Okay, Jakob Hallgren, Director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.